The third case had already begun. That was the sentence written on the final page of the previous black file. No explanation followed it. No name, no date. Only a reference number. Case 03. For several days, nobody opened the file. The reason was simple. The case did not officially exist. There was no police report, no missing person, no crime scene, no registered investigation. And yet, someone had already created a file for it. Inside were 6 photographs. The first showed an old European building standing beneath a gray winter sky. The second showed a narrow corridor. The third showed an empty staircase. The fourth showed a locked door. The fifth showed the same door from the opposite side. And the sixth photograph showed something that made the investigators stop. It showed a room. A completely ordinary room. There was an old wooden chair near the wall, a small table, a dead clock, and a single window covered by heavy curtains. Nothing appeared unusual until they compared the photograph with the building plans. The room did not exist. Not in that location, not on that floor, not anywhere inside the building. The architects had never drawn it. The builders had never recorded it, and later renovations had never mentioned it. But the photograph was real, the building was real, and someone had clearly been standing inside that room when the photograph was taken. That created the first question. Who took the photograph? The answer should have been simple. Investigators checked the original file. There was no photographer's name, no camera record, no metadata, only a date, October 17th, 23 years earlier. The building had been abandoned for almost a decade by then. Nobody was supposed to have been inside. The investigators returned to the location. The building stood exactly as it appeared in the photograph. Broken windows, peeling walls, a staircase covered in dust. Nothing had changed until they reached the corridor shown in the second photograph. There was a locked door at the end. They opened it. Behind it was a storage room, not the mysterious room. They checked the measurements. The distance from the staircase to the door was correct. The width of the corridor was correct. But according to the photograph, there should have been another room behind the wall. There wasn't. There was only solid brick. They measured the wall twice, then 3 times. The result was impossible. There was not enough space inside the building for the room shown in the photograph. One investigator suggested that the photograph had been taken somewhere else, so they enlarged the image. The wallpaper matched the building. The window frame matched another window on the same floor. Even the pattern on the floorboards was identical. It was definitely inside the building. They returned to the plans. Nothing. Then they found something strange. A small handwritten mark appeared on an old architectural copy. It was almost invisible beneath a layer of faded ink. A rectangle. Roughly the size of a room. Beside it was a single word. Unfinished. The mark had been crossed out, but beneath the crossing out was another handwritten note. 3 words. Do not open it. There was no signature, no explanation, and no indication of who had written it. The investigators searched the building again. This time, they were looking for a room that was not supposed to exist. They found nothing. Then, just before leaving, one investigator noticed something behind the wallpaper near the locked corridor. A thin vertical line, almost perfectly straight. He pulled the wallpaper away. Behind it was a door. There was no handle, no lock, no frame, just the outline of a door built directly into the wall. And beneath the dust was a small metal plate. 3 characters were engraved into it. 3, the same number written on the final page of the previous black file. The investigators stood silently in front of it. Then one of them noticed something else. The door was warm. Not slightly warm. Warm enough to prove that something was on the other side. And for the first time, the question changed. It was no longer who had taken the photograph. It was much worse. Who was inside the room now? The door was warm. That single detail changed the investigation. A sealed door should have been cold. The building had been abandoned for years. There was no heating system, no electricity, no reason for warmth to exist behind a wall. The investigators did not open it immediately. Instead, they photographed the door. They measured it. They checked the surrounding wall. Then they returned to the original architectural plans. The plans were more than 70 years old. They showed every corridor, every staircase, every room. Even the thickness of the walls was recorded. But there was no door in that location. No room, nothing. One investigator placed the old plan against the wall. The measurements matched. The corridor was exactly where the plan said it should be, but the mysterious door was not. It was as if someone had inserted an extra space into the building without changing the building around it. They began measuring the corridor from both ends. The numbers became stranger. From the staircase to the wall, there were 19 meters. From the opposite direction, there were also 19 meters. But the room visible in the photograph should have required almost 7 additional meters. Those 7 meters did not exist. There was nowhere for them to go. The investigators checked the exterior. The outside wall was intact. No extension, no hidden structure, no basement beneath that section. Nothing. Then they found an older version of the building plan. It was dated 3 years before construction had finished. This version contained something different. A small rectangular room appeared exactly where the mysterious room should have been. It had no number, no description, only a handwritten word beside it. Unfinished. The investigators compared the two plans. The room had disappeared from the official version. But someone had not simply erased it. The entire section had been redrawn. The corridor had been extended. The walls had been moved. And yet the physical building had not changed enough to explain the difference. It looked deliberate. Someone had changed the paperwork to hide something. The next question was obvious. Why? They searched the construction records. Most were missing. Several pages had been removed from the original archive. But one document survived. It was a delivery record. The date was October 1961. The building was still under construction. The record listed bricks, timber, glass, cement, and one unusual item, a steel door. The destination was written in a single line. North Interior Room. There was no room number, no floor number, nothing else. The investigators searched for a second delivery record. They found one. 2 weeks later, another steel door. Same destination, North Interior Room. That was impossible. Why would the same unfinished room require 2 steel doors? Then they noticed the dates. The first door had been delivered before the room disappeared from the plans. The second had been delivered after the room had officially ceased to exist. Someone had continued building something that no longer existed on paper. The investigators returned to the building. They stood in front of the hidden door again. The metal plate still showed 3 characters. 3. One investigator placed his hand against the surface. The warmth was still there. Then came a sound. 3 slow knocks. From the other side, nobody moved. 3 more knocks followed. Exactly the same rhythm. 3 seconds apart. The investigators stepped away from the wall. The building was silent again. They checked the corridor. Nothing. They checked the door. Still no handle. Still no lock. Then one investigator noticed a small gap beneath it. A thin line of darkness. He lowered a camera toward the opening. The screen showed darkness at first. Then the camera adjusted. A wooden floor appeared. An old chair. A small table. And a dead clock. The same objects from the photograph. The room was real. It had been there all along. But there was one new detail. The chair was facing the door. And on the seat was a fresh sheet of paper. The investigator zoomed in. There were only 4 words. You took too long. The camera suddenly went black, and from inside the room came a 4th knock. The 4th knock was different. It was louder, closer. The investigators stepped away from the wall. Nobody spoke. The camera was still connected. The screen remained completely black. Then the image returned. For less than a second, the room appeared again. The chair, the table, the dead clock, and the sheet of paper. But the message had changed. You were here before. The screen went black again. They pulled the camera away from the door. There was no explanation for what they had just seen. They decided not to open the door. Instead, they returned to the photographs from the black file. The 6th photograph showed the room exactly as the camera had captured it. The same chair, the same table, the same clock. But there was one difference. In the old photograph, the chair was facing the window. In the camera image, it was facing the door. Someone had moved it, or something had. The investigators began examining the photograph in extreme detail. They enlarged every section. The wallpaper, the floor, the window, the table. Then they noticed something in the lower corner. A reflection, barely visible in the glass of the window. A person was standing inside the room. The figure was too blurred to identify, but the clothing was clear. A dark coat, light shirt, black trousers. The investigators compared the shape with the witness photographs from the original building records. One image appeared almost identical. It belonged to a maintenance worker named Elias Voss. He had worked on the building during its final renovation. His name appeared only once in the official records. Then he disappeared. There was no termination report, no transfer, no retirement record, nothing. The investigators searched old newspapers. They found a small article from 1983. A maintenance worker had disappeared from a building scheduled for demolition. The article gave almost no details, but the name was Elias Voss. The date was October 17, the exact date written on the photograph. That changed everything. The photograph had supposedly been taken 23 years later, but Elias Voss had disappeared on that same date. The investigators checked the original photograph again. This time, they focused on the clock. Its hands were stopped at 2:17. They searched the old investigation notes. Elias Voss had last been seen at 2:17 in the afternoon. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. But there was still another problem. The photograph had a physical film negative. It was not a digital image. The negative was developed in a laboratory. The investigators contacted the laboratory. The technician who processed the photograph was still alive. He remembered the image, not because it was unusual, because of the date. He said the film had arrived without a sender. There was no envelope, no address. Someone had simply left it at the laboratory reception desk. The film contained 6 photographs. 5 were ordinary. The 6th showed the impossible room. The technician had assumed it was a mistake, but when he developed the negative, he noticed something strange. The photograph had been taken from inside the room, not through the doorway, not from the corridor, from the exact center of the room. The investigators asked him how he knew. He pointed to the perspective. The camera was approximately 1.5 meters above the floor, directly opposite the window, exactly where a person would have been standing. Then he said something he had never written in his report. There was a 7th frame. The technician remembered seeing it, but it had not appeared on the final roll. He said the 7th frame showed the same room, only this time, someone was sitting in the chair. The investigators asked who. The technician shook his head. He could not remember the face, but he remembered the clothing: a dark coat, light shirt, black trousers, the same figure seen in the window reflection. They searched the laboratory archives. After several hours, they found the original processing envelope. There was a handwritten note on the back: 7 frames exposed, only 6 developed. Underneath it was another sentence. The 7th frame was blank, but someone had written on it, "Do not develop again." The investigators took the envelope back to the black file office. They placed the original photograph beside the architectural plans. Then they noticed something they had missed. The room in the photograph had a second window. The building had only one window on that side, which meant the photograph was not simply showing a room that should not exist. It was showing a room with an architecture that could not exist. And then they found the first real contradiction. The photograph was dated October 17, but the clock inside the room showed 2:17, the same time Elias Voss disappeared. That could have been coincidence, except for one detail. The photograph had been developed 23 years before the disappearance was officially recorded. The investigators stared at the date, then at the clock, then at the photograph. For the first time, they considered a possibility none of them wanted to say aloud. Maybe the photograph had not recorded what happened in the room. Maybe it had recorded what was going to happen. And if that was true, the room was not hiding an old event. It was waiting for another one. The investigators stopped treating the photograph as evidence of the past. They began treating it as a warning. The room had appeared in a photograph before investigators knew where it was. The clock showed the exact time Elias Voss disappeared, and now the same room had been found again. But there was still one question: how could anyone enter it? They returned to the building early the next morning. The hidden door was still there. The metal plate still showed 03. The wall around it was cold. The door itself was warm. They scanned the surface with thermal equipment. The heat came from the other side. There was no electrical wiring behind the wall, no heating pipe, no machinery. Nothing that could explain the temperature. They opened the original building plans again. This time they followed every possible route leading toward the room. They found 3. The first route began at the main corridor. It ended at the hidden door. The second route appeared to begin behind a storage room. The third was shown on the oldest construction plan. It began below the building. 3 entrances, 3 different routes, but only one existed on the current plans. They tested the first. The hidden door did not open. There was no handle, no keyhole, no mechanism, only the thin gap beneath it. They tried the second route. Behind the storage room, they found a section of newer brickwork. The wall sounded hollow. They removed several loose bricks. Behind them was a narrow passage. It was barely wide enough for one person. The passage ran for approximately 6 meters. Then it stopped. At the end was another steel door. This one had a handle. They opened it. The door led back into the same storage room. They measured the distance. 6 meters in, 6 meters back. Yet the passage had returned them to the exact place where they had started. They repeated the measurement. Same result. There was no hidden turn, no second corridor, no opening. The passage simply appeared to connect 2 points that should never have connected. One investigator marked the floor with chalk, a straight line, an arrow pointing toward the door. They walked through the passage again. When they returned, the chalk mark was gone. Nobody had touched it. They searched the floor. Nothing. Then they noticed something worse. The arrow had appeared on the opposite side of the passage, pointing toward them. They stopped the investigation for the day, but the third route remained. The basement. The oldest plans showed a staircase beneath the northern corridor. The current building had no basement staircase there. They searched anyway. Behind a collapsed section of plaster, they found a narrow concrete staircase. It descended only 11 steps. At the bottom was a wall. No door, no passage, just solid concrete. But the wall had the same metal plate. 3. They measured the distance between the basement wall and the hidden room above. The numbers did not match. The basement wall was directly beneath the room, but the room should have been 7 meters farther east. There was no explanation. Then the investigator holding the old plan noticed something. The room was not drawn as a rectangle. It was drawn slightly differently. One side was longer. Another side was shorter. It looked almost like the room had been turned. They compared it with the photograph. The shape matched, but when they compared it with the real building, it could not fit. One investigator suggested that the original architect had simply made an error. Then they found the architect's handwritten calculations. Every measurement was correct. The room had been deliberately drawn that way. They searched the construction archives for the architect's notes. Most pages were missing. One survived. It contained a single sentence. The room cannot be measured from inside. No explanation followed. The investigators returned to the hidden door. This time, they placed measuring equipment on both sides. One device remained outside. Another was pushed beneath the gap. The device measured the distance to the opposite wall. 7 meters. That was impossible. The camera had already shown a wooden floor inside. Now the measurement confirmed there was a space behind the door. 7 meters of empty space. But the exterior wall was less than 1 meter thick. The investigators checked the equipment. It was functioning correctly. They tried again. 7 meters. Then the camera moved forward. The image appeared. The wooden floor, the chair, the table, the dead clock. But something had changed. The chair was no longer facing the door. It was facing the camera. On the table was another sheet of paper. The camera zoomed in. 5 words were written across it. There are 3 ways in. Then the paper moved. Not because of wind. There was no wind. It slowly slid toward the edge of the table. And beneath it was another message. Only one leads out. The camera operator froze. Then the room lights flickered. The building had no electricity. The camera feed went dark. When it returned, the chair was empty, but someone was standing beside the window. The figure wore a dark coat, light shirt, black trousers, the same clothing from the old photograph. The figure slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the camera. Then the recording ended. Nobody spoke. They looked at the 3 possible entrances. For the first time, they understood the real problem. The room did not have one hidden entrance. It had 3. And somewhere inside the black file was evidence that someone had already used all 3. The investigators had 3 entrances. They had 1 room, but they still had no explanation for who had built it. The answer was buried somewhere in the building's history, so they stopped looking at the room. They started looking at the people who had worked there. The first name was Elias Voss, the maintenance worker who disappeared at 2:17 on October 17th. But Elias was not the only person connected to the room. His name appeared in an old maintenance ledger. The ledger was damaged. Several pages were missing. But the surviving entries contained something unusual. Every few months, someone had recorded repairs to the northern interior section. The wording was always the same. Inspection completed. Door secured. Interior inaccessible. The first entry was dated 1962. The final one was dated 1983. That meant someone had been checking the room for more than 20 years. The investigators searched for the workers responsible. Most names were ordinary maintenance staff, but one name appeared again and again: Elias Voss. His signature appeared beside nearly every inspection. The investigators compared the signatures. They were genuine, but something was wrong. Elias had signed an inspection report on October 18, 1983, one day after he disappeared. They checked the original disappearance report. It stated that Elias was last seen on October 17 at 2:17. There was no mistake. He was officially missing before he signed the next day's document. That should have been enough to suggest a forged signature. But the handwriting expert disagreed. The signature on the October 18 report matched Elias perfectly. Not approximately, perfectly. The same pressure. The same angle. The same unusual mark beneath the letter V. The investigator asked the obvious question: could someone else have copied it? The expert said yes, but there was another problem. The report had been written by hand, and the ink was the same ink used in Elias's previous entries. They searched the maintenance office. A locked cabinet contained old keys, hundreds of them. Most were labeled basement, boiler room, storage, roof, electrical. One key had no label. It was heavier than the others, and on its handle was the number 03. The investigators tested it against the hidden door. It fit. For the first time, they had a way inside. But before using it, they searched the ledger again. Near the final page was a note written in different handwriting: "Do not send anyone alone." Underneath it was another sentence: "If the door is open, leave the building." The note was not signed. But the investigators noticed the date: October 17, 1983. The same day Elias disappeared. They turned the page. There was one final entry: October 18th. Inspection completed. No problems found. Signed, Elias Voss. The investigators stared at the signature. Then they noticed something underneath it. A second line had been scratched into the paper. It was almost impossible to see. They held the page under a bright light. The words became visible. He came back. Nobody knew who the sentence referred to. Elias? Someone else? Or something that had been inside the room? They continued searching. Behind the maintenance cabinet, they discovered a narrow compartment. Inside was a small cassette recorder. The tape was labeled with one date: October 17, 1983. They played it. At first, there was only static. Then footsteps. Slow footsteps moving across a wooden floor. A door closed. Someone breathed heavily. Then Elias spoke. His voice was calm. Almost too calm. He said he had entered the room. He said the room looked exactly as it had looked the previous time. Then he said something that made the investigators stop the recording. The room had changed. Not the furniture, not the walls. The distance. He said the door was only 3 steps away when he entered, but after turning around, it was more than 20 meters away. He kept walking toward it. It kept moving away. Then Elias said there was another door. He opened it. Behind it was the same room. He opened another. The same room. Another. The same room again. 3 doors, 1 room, no exit. Then the recording became quiet. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing happened. Then Elias whispered, "I think this room remembers everyone who enters." A sound followed. 3 knocks. The exact same rhythm the investigators had heard behind the hidden door. Elias spoke again. This time his voice was different. He sounded frightened. He said, "Someone is knocking from inside the room." The recording ended. The investigators rewound it. They listened again. Then they noticed something they had missed. Behind Elias's voice was another sound, very faint. Someone was whispering. The audio was cleaned. The whisper became clearer. It said one sentence, not in Elias's voice, not in anyone else's voice. The voice sounded extremely close to the microphone. It said, "Elias is not the first. The investigators stopped the tape. They searched the archives again. This time, they looked for anyone who had disappeared before Elias. They found two names, both connected to the same building. Both disappeared on October 17th, and both had worked in the northern interior section. The first disappeared in 1962, the second in 1971. Elias disappeared in 1983. The years were different. The date was identical, October 17, 3 disappearances, 21 years apart, and suddenly the number on the door made sense. 3. It did not mean the room was case 3. It might have meant something else. 3 people had already entered. 3 people had disappeared. And the investigators were now standing outside the same door. The last page of the ledger contained one final sentence. Someone had written it recently. The ink was still dark. Do not let the third person enter. The warning was clear. Do not let the third person enter. But nobody knew what it meant. 3 people had disappeared on the same date. 3 people had entered the room, and now the investigators had found a door marked 03. The obvious conclusion was that the number referred to the third disappearance. But there was another possibility. The number referred to the third person who entered. The investigators argued about what to do next. One wanted the building sealed. Another wanted the door removed. A third believed they finally had enough evidence to enter. Nobody wanted to be the first person through the door, so they changed the plan. They would use a camera. The small camera was attached to a flexible cable. It could be pushed through the gap beneath the door. The investigators turned off every light in the corridor. Then they switched on the camera. The screen showed the room, the wooden floor, the chair, the table, the dead clock. Nothing moved. The camera moved farther inside. The room appeared larger than expected. Much larger. The corridor outside was only 19 meters long, but the camera showed more than 20 meters of floor before reaching the opposite wall. The investigators checked the distance again. The camera was correct. The room was physically larger than the building could contain. Then the camera reached the table. The sheet of paper was still there. The message had changed again. This time, come inside. The investigators froze. Nobody had touched the paper. The camera continued forward. Behind the table was the chair. It was facing the window. On the chair was a dark coat, the same type of coat seen in the old photograph. The investigator operating the camera zoomed in. There was something inside the coat pocket, a small metal object. He moved the camera closer. It was a key, the same shape as the key marked 03. Then the camera turned toward the window. The glass was completely black. Not because it was dark outside. The window appeared to have no reflection at all. The investigator moved the camera closer. His own reflection did not appear. Neither did the camera. Then a face appeared in the glass. Only for a moment. A man, pale, expressionless, wearing a dark coat. The investigators pulled the camera back. The face disappeared. They replayed the footage. It happened again. But this time they noticed something. The face looked directly at the camera, and its mouth moved. The audio was almost silent. They increased the volume. A whisper became audible. Open the door. Nobody moved. Then the camera cable suddenly pulled forward. Someone or something inside had grabbed it. The investigator tried to hold it. The cable tightened, then went completely loose. The camera disappeared into the room. They had lost the connection. For several seconds, there was only static. Then the image returned. The camera was lying on the floor. The room looked empty. The chair was gone. The table was gone. The clock was gone. Everything had disappeared. Only the wallpaper remained. The investigators watched in silence. Then the camera slowly turned. The chair was now behind it. The table was beside it. The clock was on the floor. The entire room had rearranged itself. The investigator whispered that they should leave. Then the camera moved again. It approached the wall opposite the window. There was a message written directly onto the wallpaper. We remember you. The camera stopped. A second message appeared beneath it. One of you has been here before. The investigators looked at each other. None of them had ever entered the room. At least, none of them remembered doing so. Then one investigator noticed something on the floor. A photograph. The camera moved toward it. The image came into focus. It showed the same group of investigators standing in the corridor, but the photograph had been taken from inside the room, and the date printed on the bottom was 3 days earlier. The investigation had started only yesterday. Nobody spoke. The camera suddenly turned toward the door. Someone was standing there. Inside the room, the figure wore the same dark coat, the same light shirt, the same black trousers. The figure slowly raised one hand, then pointed at one of the investigators. The camera feed went black. The corridor fell silent. Then the hidden door clicked. For the first time since they had found it, the door moved. It opened inward, only a few centimeters. A cold darkness appeared behind it. The investigator nearest the door stepped back. Nobody touched the handle. Nobody pushed it. The door opened another few centimeters. Then they heard a voice. It was faint, almost impossible to understand, but it sounded like a man, and the words were clear. You already entered. The investigator looked at the others. Nobody understood. Then the door opened completely. Beyond it was the room from the photograph. The chair, the table, the dead clock, everything was exactly where it had been, except for one thing. There was no window, and on the wall opposite them was another door. The same metal plate. 3. The investigators slowly stepped inside. Behind them, the original doorway disappeared. Not closed. Disappeared. The wall became solid. They were trapped. Then the dead clock began ticking. Once, twice, 3 times. Its hands moved backward, from 2:17 to 2:16 to 2:15, then stopped. A voice came from behind the second door, Elias Voss, and he said, "You should never have opened the third door." The investigators stood inside the room. Nobody moved. The doorway behind them was gone. There was only a solid wall. The room looked ordinary again. The chair stood beside the table. The dead clock hung above it. The second door remained closed. 3 characters were engraved into its metal plate. 3. One investigator checked his phone. No signal. Another checked his watch. The time had stopped at 2:17. Every watch in the room showed the same time. Then someone noticed a folder on the table. It had not been there when they entered. The cover was black. No name, no date. Only one word. Black file. The investigator opened it. Inside was a photograph. It showed the same room, but the photograph was much older. The paper had yellowed. The image was damaged. At the bottom was a handwritten number. 1. They turned the page. Another photograph. The same room. Another date. Another number. 2. Then a third photograph. The same room again. This time the number was 03. The investigators stared at one another. The black file was not documenting 3 separate cases. It was documenting the same room. 3 times. They continued turning the pages. Each file contained the same pattern. A photograph, a disappearance, a date. Then silence. Case 01. A man entered the room in 1962. He never returned. Case 02. Another man entered in 1971. He never returned. Case 03. Elias Voss entered in 1983. He never returned. But the final page contained something different. It was dated yesterday. The investigators recognized the handwriting. It belonged to nobody in the room. The sentence was short. The third case has already begun. That was the sentence from the previous black file. They finally understood why it had appeared before they discovered the room. The file had not predicted their investigation. It had recorded it. One investigator turned to the final page. There was a photograph attached to it. The photograph showed the investigators standing outside the hidden door. They were exactly where they had been that morning. But the photograph had been taken from inside the room. The investigator looked at the wall. There was no camera, no opening, no window, nothing. Then he noticed another detail. One person in the photograph was different. There were 4 investigators in the picture, but only 3 were standing in the corridor. The 4th figure was inside the room, behind them, wearing a dark coat. The same figure from the old photographs. They turned around. Nothing was there. Then the dead clock started ticking again. 2:16, 2:15, 2:14. The hands were moving backward. One investigator opened the black file again. A new page had appeared. It had not been there seconds earlier. The page contained a single photograph. It showed the room from above. For the first time, they could see the complete structure. The room was not rectangular, it was circular. But the walls formed 3 separate corridors. Each corridor ended at a door. 3 doors, 3 entrances, 3 possible exits. The investigator studied the photograph. Then he noticed something impossible. One of the 3 doors was open. Beyond it was not another room, It was the same corridor they had entered from. The second door showed the basement. The third showed the building's exterior. The photograph appeared to prove that the room had 3 exits. But there was another detail. The door leading outside was marked with a number, 4. The investigators became silent. The room had always been marked 03, but now there was a 4th door, marked 04. The folder contained no explanation. They searched the pages again. Case 01, Case 02, Case 03. Nothing about Case 04. Then a sheet of paper fell from the back of the folder. It contained a list of names. 3 names were crossed out: Elias Voss, Martin Hale, Jonas Krell. The first 2 names matched the missing workers. The third name was unfamiliar. One investigator read the next line. It was not a name. It was a question. Who will be 4th? The lights inside the room flickered. The second door opened. Slowly. Behind it was darkness. Then came a sound. Footsteps. Someone was walking toward them. The investigator holding the folder whispered that they should leave. But there was nowhere to go. The original entrance had disappeared. The door marked 04 was visible across the room. The second door was opening, and behind it, someone was approaching. The footsteps stopped. A man's voice came through the darkness. The voice sounded old, weak, almost forgotten. But one investigator recognized it, Elias Voss. He said, "You found the second file." A pause. Then, "You were never supposed to find the first." The voice belonged to Elias Voss. Or at least, it sounded like him. The investigators stood motionless. The second door remained open. Beyond it was complete darkness. Then Elias spoke again. "You found the second file." A pause. Then his voice became quieter. "You were never supposed to find the first." The investigator holding the folder asked the question nobody else wanted to ask. "Where are you?" Silence. Then 3 knocks came from inside the darkness. The same rhythm, 3 seconds apart. One investigator stepped toward the door. Another grabbed his arm. They had already learned what happened when someone entered without understanding the room. They needed answers first. So they began searching the black file. The first theory was simple. The room was a hidden architectural space. Perhaps the original builders had created it for a secret purpose. The altered plans could have been an attempt to conceal it. The 3 disappearances could have been accidents. That explanation worked for the building, but it did not explain the photographs. It did not explain the changing position of the room, and it did not explain why the black file contained photographs taken before some of the events they showed. The second theory was more disturbing. Someone had deliberately created the mystery. A hidden group could have maintained the room for decades. They could have altered records, moved objects, created false photographs, even manipulated witnesses. The investigators searched the documents for evidence of such a group. Nothing. No organization. No name. No symbol. Only the number 03. The third theory involved something far less ordinary. The room might not obey the same physical dimensions as the building. The measurements suggested it had more internal space than should have been possible. The 3 entrances appeared to lead to different locations, and the photographs showed different versions of the same room. Perhaps the room was not fixed in one place. Perhaps it connected places that should never have connected. One investigator rejected the idea immediately. He said there had to be a physical explanation. Then he looked at the floor. The wooden boards beneath his feet were numbered. Not randomly. They formed a sequence. 1.2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The numbers continued across the floor. There were more than 30, but the room itself was nowhere near large enough to contain 30 numbered sections. He counted again. 36. 36 floor sections. The room had somehow become larger while they were standing inside it. The fourth theory was even simpler. The room was being used to hide people. The disappearances were not supernatural. They were deliberate. Someone could have built secret passages. Someone could have moved the walls. Someone could have created false records. The investigators searched for mechanical systems. They found none. No hidden motors. No sliding walls. No ventilation shafts. No electrical controls. Nothing. Then they discovered the chair. It was not an ordinary wooden chair. Underneath it was a small metal plate. 3 letters were engraved into the surface. EV. Elias Voss. They turned the chair over. A narrow compartment had been built into the bottom. Inside was a folded piece of paper. The investigator opened it. There were 4 lines. I entered through the first door. I escaped through the second. The third was never opened. Then the final line. Until now. The investigators looked toward the three doors. The door marked O3 was directly behind them. The second door remained open. The door marked 04 stood across the room. There should have been no fourth door. Yet it was there. They began to understand the numbering. The doors might not represent rooms. They might represent stages. The first door was the entrance. The second was the exit. The third was the room itself. And the fourth was something else. Something that had not existed during Elias's disappearance. The investigator turned the page over. There was writing on the back. 3 names. Elias Voss. Martin Hale. Jonas Krell. Then a 4th name. But this one had not been crossed out. The name was familiar. It belonged to one of the investigators standing inside the room. Nobody spoke. He looked at the others. They looked back at him. He said he had never seen the name before. But the handwriting beneath it was his. He recognized it immediately. The room had not simply recorded the people who entered. It had recorded people before they entered. Then the voice returned from the second door. Elias spoke again. You keep looking for an explanation. The investigators froze. The voice continued. There is one, but you will not like it. The door opened wider. A faint light appeared beyond it. For the first time, they could see a corridor. An ordinary corridor. The same corridor outside the hidden door. Except it looked older. Much older. The walls were clean. The lights worked. The floor was untouched. It was the building as it had looked decades earlier. Then a man walked into view. Elias Voss. He looked exactly as he had appeared in the old photograph. Dark coat, light shirt, black trousers. But he was not old. He looked exactly the age he had been when he disappeared. He stopped in front of the doorway. He looked directly at the investigators. Then he said, "The room does not keep people, it keeps moments." The lights behind him went out, and when they came back on, Elias was gone. The corridor was empty, but something had been left on the floor, a cassette recorder. The investigator picked it up. A label was attached to it. October 17th, 2:17. He pressed play. A voice came through the speaker, his own voice, recorded several hours in the future. It said, "Do not trust the room." Then another voice whispered behind it, "Do not trust yourself." The recording ended. Nobody moved. The investigator was still holding the cassette recorder. He looked at the others. They were staring at him. The voice on the tape had been his. There was no doubt. The words had been spoken in his voice, but he had never recorded them. At least, not yet. He played the tape again, the same sentence. "Do not trust the room." Then the whisper, "Do not trust yourself." They checked the recorder. The tape was old, much older than the investigation. The plastic case was scratched. The label had faded, yet the recording contained their own voices. One investigator asked how that was possible. Nobody answered. Then they noticed something on the wall, a clock. It showed 2:17, the same time as the other clock, the same time Elias Voss disappeared. The investigator checked his watch. 2:16. Only 1 minute remained. They had no idea what would happen at 2:17, so they began searching the room again. They opened the drawers. Nothing. They moved the table. Nothing. They lifted the chair. Nothing. Then someone noticed a small crack in the floor. A narrow metal strip was hidden beneath the wooden boards. They pulled it upward. Underneath was a shallow compartment. Inside was a photograph. This photograph was different. It showed the room from outside. The investigators were standing in the corridor. The hidden door was open, but the photograph contained 4 people, 3 investigators, and Elias Voss. He was standing behind them. The date was printed beneath the image, October 17th, 1983. The investigators stared at it. Then one of them noticed the background. Behind Elias was another door, a door marked 04. But according to the old records, door 04 had never existed in 1983. It appeared only now. They searched the room for another photograph. They found one inside the cassette recorder. It showed the same corridor. This time, Elias was gone. A different person stood behind the investigators. The person was wearing a dark coat. The face was impossible to see. The date was today's date. The investigator dropped the photograph. Then the clock moved. 2:17. Every sound stopped. The room became completely silent. The dead clock began ticking. Once, twice, 3 times. Then the second door opened. Behind it was the corridor again. But this time, someone was standing at the far end. Elias. He was holding something. A file. He walked toward them slowly. As he approached, the investigator noticed the file cover. Black, no title, only a number. 4. Elias stopped several meters away. He placed the file on the floor. Then he stepped backward. The door behind him closed. The investigators waited. Nothing happened. Finally, one of them picked up the file. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Every photograph showed the same room. Different years, different furniture, different people. But the room never changed. They turned the pages faster. 1962, 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, and then the current year, August 11th, 2026. The final photograph showed the investigators inside the room. It had been taken from above. The person taking it was standing somewhere near the ceiling. There was no camera visible. Then they found the final page. It contained no photograph, only a handwritten message. The room has never been the mystery. One investigator read it aloud. Underneath was another sentence. The people who find it are. The page ended there, but the back contained one final line. The third case was never about Elias. It was about whoever came after him. The investigators looked at the door marked 04. It was open. Beyond it was a staircase. They had never seen that staircase before. It led upward. They followed it. At the top was a small room. Inside was an old desk. On the desk was another black file. This one had no number. The investigator opened it. The first page contained a photograph. It showed the same room, but something was different. There was no chair, no table, no clock. The room was completely empty. Then he turned the page. A sentence was written across it. The room was empty before we arrived. Another page. It became empty after we left. Another. The room is not a place. The final page contained one question. If the room has no beginning, where did the first photograph come from? The investigator looked back toward the staircase. The door at the bottom was slowly closing. Then the cassette recorder in his hand started playing by itself. His own voice returned. This time it sounded terrified. If you can hear this, do not open the third door. The recording stopped. The investigator looked at the metal plate. 3. Then he noticed something that had not been there before. The number had changed. It now read 4. The number on the door had changed. 03 was gone. 04 was now engraved into the metal. Nobody touched it. Nobody moved. The investigators stood at the top of the staircase, staring down at the door. The room had changed again, but this time, something else had changed with it. The black file on the desk was open. The final page was no longer blank. New words were appearing across it, one line at a time. The third case is complete. The investigators watched in silence. Another line appeared. The fourth has begun. Then another. Do not look behind you. Nobody moved. For several seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then one investigator slowly turned. There was nothing behind him, only the old desk, the empty wall, and a photograph lying on the floor. He picked it up. It showed the room they were standing in, but the photograph had been taken from the opposite corner. The investigators were visible inside it, all 3 of them, and behind them stood Elias Voss. The investigator turned toward the empty corner. Nothing. He looked back at the photograph. Elias was still there. Then something appeared beneath his feet. A door. The photograph showed a door in the floor. There was no such door in the room. The investigator looked down. The floor was solid. Then came 3 knocks. From underneath them. The same rhythm. 3 seconds apart. The black file closed by itself. The lights went out. When they returned, the room had changed completely. The desk was gone. The staircase was gone. The walls were different. The investigators were standing in the original corridor. The hidden door was gone. There was no metal plate, no crack, no entrance, nothing. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then one investigator checked his watch. 2:18. Only 1 minute had passed, but the building outside had changed. The windows were no longer broken. The walls had been repaired. The lights worked. The building looked exactly as it had decades earlier. They walked toward the main entrance. Outside, the street was different. Older cars, Different signs, different people. One investigator looked at the date on a newspaper stand. October 18th, 1983. They had not returned to the present. They had returned to the day after Elias Voss disappeared. Then they saw him. Elias was standing across the street, alive. He looked directly at them. He did not seem surprised. He simply walked toward them. When he reached the group, he said one sentence. "You finally found the beginning." The investigator asked him where they were. Elias looked back at the building. He said, "This is where the room starts." Then he looked at the investigator. "And this is where it ends." Behind them, the building disappeared. Not collapsed, not destroyed. It simply became invisible. The street remained. The people remained. The investigators remained. But the building was gone. They looked at Elias. He was gone too. On the ground where he had been standing was a black folder. The investigator picked it up. The cover contained no number, only 2 words. Black file. Inside was one photograph. The room. Empty. No chair. No table. No clock. No doors. Nothing. Beneath the photograph was a final message. The room never had a beginning. The investigator turned the page. Another message appeared. It was written in the same handwriting as the previous files. The first person to enter did not find the room. He created it. The investigators looked at one another. The mystery had changed completely. The room was not an ancient secret. It was not a hidden architectural space. It was not simply a place where people disappeared. It was something created by the first person who entered. And that person had never been identified. The final page contained 3 names: Martin Hale, Jonas Krell, Elias Voss. Then a 4th space. It was empty. The investigators waited. Ink slowly appeared. A name began forming. One letter. Then another. Then another. The investigator watched his own name being written. He stepped backward. The page stopped. His name was incomplete. Only the first 3 letters remained. Then the folder slammed shut. The investigators opened it again. The page was blank. No names. No photograph. Nothing. They looked toward the place where the building had disappeared. There was only an empty street. The case appeared finished. But one question remained. If the room had no beginning, why had someone written the first photograph's date, October 17? Why had 3 people disappeared on that exact date? Why had the room been waiting for them? And most importantly, who took the first photograph? The black file gave no answer. Only one final sentence appeared on the inside cover. The third case is closed. The room is not. Then, somewhere behind the investigators, 3 slow knocks. And this time, they came from the inside of the black file.